I am Rachel Cohen, 28 years old, a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and I never imagined that the first time I would truly fear for my life inside my own quarters, it would not be from an enemy overseas, but from my own blood. The night it happened, the door to my barracks slammed open so violently the hinges shrieked, and Cade Cohen, my cousin, stormed inside with a face twisted by rage. Before I could rise, his fist smashed against my cheek, the crack echoing through my skull, and my body hit the cold floor with the sharp taste of copper flooding my mouth. His boot drove into my ribs, my arm gave way with a sickening snap, and every breath became agony as I tried to crawl toward the photo of my mother. Cade hurled the frame against the wall glass, raining down, then crouched beside me with a shard pressed against my skin, and whispered that my mother was weak, and so was I. My vision swam, but then the door opened again, and my father, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cohen, appeared crisp and imposing, polished shoes clicking as he stepped into the chaos. Relief surged through me for a single heartbeat, the desperate thought that he would stop this, that the man who once pinned the bars on my collar and told me honor is all we have would protect me. I whispered for help, but he only stared, his face carved from stone. No shock, no horror, only silence. Then his words fell like a blade, calm and cold, saying, I had disappointed him, that a real soldier knew when to stand down, that I had pushed Cade to this. In that moment, the pain of my broken bones faded compared to the sharper pain of betrayal, the knowledge that the man I lived my life to impress had erased me with a single sentence. Cade's laughter filled the room ugly and triumphant, while my father's sneer sealed my isolation. That was the night I understood that if my own father would not be my shield, I would have to become my own, and though I did not yet know how, I knew this would not be the end of my story. And before I take you further into what came after that night, I want you to pause with me. If you have ever been made to feel like a sacrifice for someone else's pride, if you have ever been betrayed by the very people meant to protect you, let me know where you are watching from, and please press like because every voice matters, and mine begins here. I grew up in a household where silence was heavier than gunfire and expectations pressed harder than any pack I carried on a forced march. My name is Rachel Cohen, daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cohen, a man who believed discipline was not a teaching tool, but the only air we were allowed to breathe. My earliest memories are of standing ramrod straight in our living room while he inspected the shine on my shoes before I was even tall enough to lace them properly. My mother was the only warmth in that house, the one who whispered verses from Psalms into my ear when I trembled after hearing my father's boots echo down the hall. She told me I was enough just as I was, but she died when I was 11, leaving me alone with a man who replaced comfort with commands. It was also around that time Cade entered my life more often. He was 2 years older already, arrogant, already carrying himself as though the world owed him respect, though he had never earned it. My father doted on him, not me. When Cade's grades slipped or when he skipped training drills, my father excused it as youthful energy. When I brought home top scores or medals from school competitions, he nodded once said that was expected and returned his attention to Cade. That imbalance shaped my life like a relentless hammer striking the same place again and again. The more I tried to shine, the more invisible I became. By the time I entered the Naval Academy, I had made a vow to myself if my father could not see me through the lens of daughter, then I would force him to see me through the lens of soldier. I pushed myself past breaking points. I ran extra laps when others collapsed, memorized every page of every manual until my eyes burned, and when I was commissioned as a lieutenant, I clutched that moment like a lifeline. I can still feel the weight of the day he pinned the silver bars on my collar. For a fleeting moment, I thought his hands trembled with pride. Cameras flashed, relatives applauded, and Cade stood in the crowd with a bitter line across his mouth. My father leaned in and whispered that honor was all we had, then stepped back without a smile. That moment, that whisper was enough for me then. I told myself if I kept serving, kept excelling one day, he would give me more than that single sentence. But Cade's bitterness festered. Every time I returned from deployment with a commendation, he found a way to cheapen it. He told anyone who would listen that I was reckless, that I endangered others, that the medals belonged to the unit, not to me. What made it worse was my father's silence. By staying quiet, he validated Cade's lies. Relatives repeated them at family gatherings. I sat through dinners where my father praised Cade for trivial things, while ignoring the fact that I had pulled comrades out of gunfire. The gap between us widened a canyon carved by years of dismissal. Still, I chased his approval because that is what children of men like Isaac Cohen do. We bleed ourselves dry for a drop of recognition. I tried to cling to the memory of my mother, to the way she once kept a cedar chest of her journals, letters, and photographs telling me these were our story and I must never forget. That chest became my anchor. Whenever my father's coldness cut deep, I would sit with my mother's words and remember that someone had once seen me. Yet even that anchor could not protect me from the poison of Cade's resentment and my father's obsession with family honor. Cade floundered in his career, barely scraping by, but he wore his last name like armor convinced it gave him worth. My father reinforced that belief, calling him the legacy of the Cohen men while calling me stubborn reckless, too emotional for true leadership. Emotional undulation defined my entire youth, one moment a glimmer of pride when my father introduced me to his fellow officers as his daughter in uniform. The next moment, humiliation when he praised Cade's every minor effort in the same breath. I can still see Cade smirking at me across the table, basking in the attention I longed for. That pattern etched scars no metal could erase. Over time, I learned to carry both pride and pain in equal measure to let the contradiction drive me harder. But even then, I never expected that the man I called father would one day side so openly with the cousin who despised me. That is why the night in the barracks cut so deep. It was not just Cade's fists, not just the bones that cracked. It was the final confirmation that in my father's eyes I was never the soldier, never the daughter worth defending. Looking back, I see the road was always leading here. From the day my mother's voice was silenced, Cade and my father closed ranks, creating a fortress where I was the enemy. And yet, in the darkest moments, I clung to that fleeting memory of silver bars on my collar and my father whispering that honor was all we had. That contradiction kept me alive. Because if he believed honor mattered, then one day I would prove to him that mine was unbreakable. That is the truth of toxic families. They make you believe love is conditional. Recognition is rationed, and worth must be earned through pain. They teach you that silence is survival, but silence can only last so long before it becomes suffocating. For me, it lasted years, shaping every step until the night it shattered under Cade's fists and my father's sneer. That is the night my old life ended, but to understand why it broke me, you must understand how carefully that trap was built. This is not just the story of one attack. It is the story of decades of erasure of a girl who tried to become a soldier to win her father's gaze and of a cousin who could not stand to see her succeed. That history is why the betrayal burned brighter than any wound. It was not sudden. It was the final piece of a puzzle that had been laid out for years. And knowing that truth made what came after inevitable. The night Cade attacked me was not just an eruption of jealousy, but the culmination of years of poisoned rivalry fueled by my father's silence. It began with the slam of my barracks door and ended with the cold verdict of betrayal that still echoes in my bones. Cade's fists rained down with a fury that was less about me and more about what I represented, a woman who had succeeded where he had failed. His knuckles cracked against my jaw, and the pain burst like fireworks behind my eyes. I tasted iron, felt the throb of blood rushing from the wound, and still I tried to rise. My training screamed at me to fight back, to engage, but my body betrayed me. My arm twisted beneath me at an unnatural angle, a sharp fracture that sent waves of nausea through me. I remember clawing at the floor tiles, desperate to get traction while Cade's boot pinned me down. He laughed, the sound ugly and triumphant, as though each blow proved his superiority. When he saw the photo of my mother on the nightstand, he seized it with a sneer and hurled it against the wall, the frame shattering into fragments that glittered in the fluorescent light. He picked up a jagged piece of glass and pressed it against my cheek. The sting was immediate, a shallow scrape, but the real wound was his whisper. "Your mother was weak just like you." Those words cut deeper than the glass because they desecrated the one memory I clung to. I whispered no, tried to summon strength, but Cade pressed harder, his voice dropping into a guttural snarl as he told me I would always be beneath him. My breath came shallow, ragged, and the world spun as pain radiated from my broken arm and battered ribs. Just as darkness threatened to swallow me, the door opened again. Relief surged through me when I saw the silhouette of my father framed in the doorway. Crisp uniform, polished shoes, a presence that had once meant safety. "Dad!" I whispered, my voice trembling with hope. "He is here. He will stop this." My body shook as I tried to push myself up, bones grinding with every movement, but my father's face was unreadable. His eyes scanned the chaos, the overturned furniture, his daughter bleeding on the floor, his nephew towering over me, and yet not a flicker of horror crossed his features. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I pleaded again, "Help me, please," but his lips parted and his words fell cold and precise. "You disappointed me, Rachel." The world stopped. He was not chastising Cade, he was condemning me. His voice carried the quiet authority of command, a verdict delivered without mercy. "A real soldier knows when to stand down," he continued, "and you pushed him to this." The floor seemed to vanish beneath me. The physical pain dulled in comparison to the sharper agony of betrayal. The man I had spent my life trying to impress had erased me with a single sentence. Cade straightened, emboldened, his grin wide and ugly as he basked in my father's approval disguised as condemnation of me. His laugh echoed in the sterile room, a sound that sealed my humiliation. Then came the heavy thud of boots in the hallway. The military police burst in their faces, tense, their eyes scanning the wreckage. For a heartbeat, I believed justice would arrive with them. I tried to cry out to tell them what Cade had done, but one glance at my father's collar, the silver eagle glinting under the harsh lights, shifted everything. The young MP who met my eyes held my gaze for the briefest second. I saw the flicker of pity there, even disgust, but it vanished when he turned to my father and snapped to attention. "Sir, we will handle this internally." Internally! That single word was a death sentence to truth. It meant the reports would be buried, the story rewritten, my suffering erased to protect the family name and the reputation of an officer. Cade's hands still trembled with the violence he had unleashed, but no cuffs were placed on his wrists. Instead, the MPs ushered him away gently while I lay crumpled, broken, and forgotten on the floor. My father gave me one last look, not of concern, not of compassion, but of disappointment, as though I had embarrassed him by surviving. Then he turned and walked out, leaving me in the wreckage of my own quarters, my body shattered, my spirit gasping. That night was not just an assault by Cade, it was a betrayal sanctioned by my father, validated by the system that valued reputation over justice. It was the moment I realized that the battlefield was no longer overseas, but inside my own family and within the very institution I had sworn to serve. And as the fluorescent light buzzed above me and the ringing in my ears drowned out the last sounds of retreating boots, one truth hardened inside me. If I was to survive, if I was ever to reclaim my voice, I would have to become my own shield because no one in that room would do it for me. The hours after the attack blurred into a haze of sterile lights, clipped voices, and the heavy weight of isolation pressing down on me more suffocating than the plaster cast on my arm. I was taken to WAC Army Medical Center, a place I had once believed represented safety and recovery. But now the antiseptic smell and the hum of fluorescent lights only reminded me of how completely abandoned I was. Doctors moved around me with professional detachment, their hands efficient, but their eyes deliberately avoiding mine as though my pain was an inconvenience. One of them explained the fracture in my ulna. Another detailed the hairline crack in my skull, but their words floated in the air, hollow and cold, because what I needed was acknowledgement, not just clinical facts. When they finished setting my arm in plaster, I was left sitting on the edge of the examination table, the crinkle of the paper beneath me sounding louder than any human voice. That was when the door opened quietly and an older nurse entered. Her name tag read Carla. She did not rush. She did not avoid my gaze. Instead, she placed a simple cup of warm water on the small table beside me, and then rested her hand gently on my shoulder. That single gesture pierced through the armor of numbness I had built in the last few hours. "Do not let their voices drown out your own honey," she whispered, and for the first time since the attack, tears slid down my face, hot and stinging. Carla did not offer empty reassurances. She simply gave me validation, the seed of truth that I was not imagining the cruelty of what had been done to me. It was the first spark of humanity in a world that had turned hostile overnight. But the warmth of her words could not follow me home. When I was discharged and returned to the house where I had grown up, hoping for the small comfort of my mother's memory, I discovered another betrayal waiting. The house looked the same from the outside, the same colonial facade, the same shutters my mother had painted years ago. But inside, the air was eerily empty. My footsteps echoed down the hallway as I searched for the one sacred thing I still had, the cedar chest that had belonged to my mother. The chest that held her journals, letters, and photographs. It had been kept in my father's study tucked near the bookshelf like a hidden sanctuary. My heart pounded as I opened the door to that study, praying that at least this one fragment of my mother's love remained untouched. But the corner where the chest had always sat was bare. Panic shot through me. I tore through the house-opening closets, pulling at attic doors, searching the garage. Nothing. Finally, with nowhere else to turn, I stepped into the back yard. The humid North Carolina air pressed against my skin, heavy and unforgiving. That was when the acrid smell of smoke hit me. In the far corner near the overflowing trash bins, I saw it a pile of blackened wood and twisted metal. I stumbled closer, my legs heavy, my breath shallow, and when I reached it, the truth slammed into me. It was the remains of the cedar chest, charred and broken, its contents reduced to ash. My knees buckled, and I sank into the damp grass, staring at the desecration of everything my mother had saved. Letters that once carried her voice were now brittle curls of black dust that disintegrated under my fingers. Photographs that once held her smile were now nothing but soot. The weight of despair pressed down until I could not breathe. This was not an accident. This was not a careless fire. This was a purge. My father had ordered it. I knew it in my bones because to him, the past was only a liability to his reputation. As I sifted through the ashes with trembling hands, I heard a voice behind me. "Miss Rachel." I turned to see Mr. Manuel, the gardener, who had tended our yard since I was a child, standing with his straw hat in his hands and sadness etched deep into his weathered face. His eyes glistened as he spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I saw him," he said quietly. "Your father carried the box out himself. He did not light the match, but he told Cade to do it. Burn it all. Clean up the past." The words cut me open all over again. My father had not only abandoned me in my moment of need, he had erased my mother's memory with deliberate cruelty. Mr. Manuel lowered his gaze, offered me a silent nod of apology, and walked away, leaving me alone with the ruin. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, and I stayed kneeling in the grass, my hands covered in soot, staring at the grave of my mother's story. The sense of loneliness was absolute. My family had excised me from their narrative, my father had consigned me to silence, and even the fragments of my mother's love had been turned to ash. I pressed my hand deeper into the pile of cinders, searching desperately for anything, some remnant that had survived. My fingers brushed against something thicker than paper rough but intact. I pulled it free and saw a small note card, its edges blackened, but the center still legible. In my mother's graceful handwriting were words she must have copied down. "Vulnerability is not weakness. It is our greatest measure of courage." I read those words again and again until the tears stopped. The fire in the backyard had destroyed her chest, but it had left me a message, a spark. Holding that charred card in my hand, I realized something vital. They thought they could erase me, thought they could erase her, but all they had done was prove how terrified they were of the truth. That was the night I understood that even in absolute loneliness there can be the beginning of resistance. The ashes were their attempt to silence me, but the words that survived would become the fuel for everything I was about to do. The night I knelt in the backyard with ash clinging to my hands and my mother's scorched note card pressed against my palm was the night a spark took root inside me. Vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage, her words declared, and for the first time since Cade's fists and my father's sneer left me broken, I felt something other than despair. I felt the first stirrings of defiance. They wanted me silent, erased, forgotten, but I would not allow them to dictate the end of my story. The next morning, I wrapped my fractured arm carefully against my chest, tucked the note card into my pocket, and drove back to WAC Medical Center. I did not go as a patient, but as a soldier gathering evidence. I found Nurse Carla in the cafeteria during her break, stirring sugar into her coffee. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me, but she said nothing until I sat across from her. My voice trembled at first, yet steadied as I explained what I needed. I told her I required an affidavit, a sworn statement about my injuries the night I was admitted, every bruise, every fracture, every detail she had observed. Carla's spoon stilled in her cup. I could see the hesitation in her face, the caution of a woman who had worked 30 years in a system that punished truth when it threatened power. Her pension, her reputation, her safety, all could be at risk if she helped me. But then she set the spoon down and her gaze locked with mine. "Honey," she said, "in 3 decades I have seen too many young women come through these doors with stories that never saw daylight because someone powerful wanted them hidden. I will not be complicit again." She slid a notepad toward me and promised to sign it in front of a notary that very afternoon. I swallowed the lump in my throat as gratitude threatened to undo me. Her signature became my first weapon, a tangible piece of truth I could hold. From there, I turned to another potential source of strength, my own memories stored not in fragile paper, but in encrypted files. Years earlier, during deployment in Syria, I had worn a helmet camera like every Marine. I had backed up the footage religiously onto a rugged hard drive that I later concealed inside a hollowed-out copy of my mother's favorite poetry book. It was still there, hidden in my personal things, but accessing it at home was impossible with my father watching every corner. So I drove 20 miles west to a small public library in a town where no one knew my name. The hum of old computers filled the back row as I slid the drive into a USB port. My hands shook as I typed the complex string of passwords, but finally the folders appeared, each labeled by date. I scrolled until I found the mission where Cade had frozen in terror while I dragged 2 wounded Marines to safety. I clicked play. Grainy video filled the screen with chaos gunfire, shouting the scramble of boots. But then came the image of Cade cowering, his rifle trembling, his voice panicked while I crawled through dust to pull men out of danger. The audio captured everything, the wheezing breath of Cade, the gratitude of the Marine. I bandaged the words. "Thank you, Cohen, you saved my life." I leaned back, breathless. This was my silver bullet, undeniable proof not only of my courage, but of Cade's cowardice. If the system wanted to credit him with my actions, they would have to do it in the face of this footage. I copied the file onto a secure drive and concealed it again. Driving back to the motel that night, I realized evidence alone might not be enough. My father had influence Cade had already started spinning lies, and the system had proven it would rather protect reputations than truth. I needed allies. I remembered whispers I had once overheard from female officers about hidden forums, online spaces where women shared stories of harassment, erasure, and betrayal. Using a borrowed laptop and an anonymous account, I searched for hours until I found one. I posted a vague message. "Has anyone here ever had an official after-action report modified or falsified by a superior officer for reasons unrelated to mission accuracy?" I logged off, uncertain if anyone would respond. When I checked again an hour later, 17 messages filled my encrypted inbox. By morning, there were more than 50. Women from every branch of the service wrote to me with stories that mirrored mine. Promotions denied credit, stolen gaslighting covered as discipline. One message from a major in the Air Force described how her bravery under fire had been rewritten to credit a general's son. She ended her message with 5 words that burned into me. "Welcome to the Sisterhood of the Scars." Reading those words, I felt the weight of loneliness begin to shift. I was not a single broken soldier, I was part of an invisible army. Their stories became my second weapon, a dossier of systemic abuse that proved my suffering was not isolated but part of a larger pattern. With Carla's affidavit, the helmet cam footage, and the voices of dozens of women at my back, I began to feel like I could breathe again. Yet even as hope flickered, danger crept closer. One evening in the motel, my burner phone buzzed with a blocked number. I answered and heard the strained whisper of Dorian Lex, a fellow lieutenant I trusted. "Rachel, listen carefully," he said. "I do not have long." Word came down from on high. "They are watching you. Your calls, your footprint, everything. Your father is pulling every string he has." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone. Heart-hammering fear icy in my veins. They knew I was resisting. They knew I was gathering weapons of truth. But beneath the fear, something else crystallized validation. If they were watching me, it meant I was a threat. And that realization steeled me. My father had taught me that honor was all we had. Cade had tried to beat that honor out of me. But now, with ashes behind me and courage in my pocket, I knew the fight was only beginning. These first steps of resistance were fragile, trembling, but they were mine. They were the line I drew in the sand against men who thought they could erase me. It began with a television screen glowing in the corner of a quiet coffee shop, a place where I thought I could breathe for an hour without feeling eyes on me, but that small screen detonated like a bomb in my chest. I was sipping bitter coffee, trying to lose myself in the pages of a book, when a familiar, patriotic score swelled and the headline blazed across the bottom. "A family sacrifice Marine hero speaks out." And there he was, Cade Cohen, sitting in full dress blues under studio lights, medals shining on his chest that had never been earned. His voice calm, his demeanor polished, spinning a narrative so perfectly rehearsed that anyone who did not know the truth would believe it without question. He told the story of Syria as though he had been the calm center of chaos, the one making the tough calls, while his younger cousin faltered, and then, with the calculated sorrow of a practiced liar, he told the nation that he loved me but that I was unstable, that combat had broken me, that I was a danger to myself and others. I sat frozen, my cup trembling in my hand, every eye in the coffee shop shifting toward the screen and then toward me as recognition dawned. Shame flushed my skin, not because I had done anything wrong, but because Cade had stolen my story and weaponized it against me. That broadcast was the first volley in a war of perception. By the next day, whispers followed me in the grocery store aisles. A woman with a gold eagle pin on her lapel confronted me at checkout, her voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear, saying I was a disgrace to the uniform that people like me mocked real soldiers like her husband. Eyes bored into me from all sides, pity and contempt twisting together until I could hardly breathe. I paid in silence, humiliation burning hotter than the fractures still healing in my bones. That night, I scrolled through my phone only to find that I had been erased from the family group chat, excised without a word, while Cade posted smiling photographs standing beside my father. The caption read, "Proud to carry on the Cohen family legacy," and beneath it flooded comments from aunts, uncles, cousins, all congratulating him, all ignoring me as though I had never existed. It was a public rewriting of history, a collective effort to make me a ghost. I should have felt rage, but what I felt was the crushing weight of invisibility. They were winning the war of narrative. In military terms, I had lost the initiative. The enemy had taken the field and framed me as unstable before I could present a single piece of evidence. Yet the lesson every officer learns is that when you are pinned down, you must adapt, maneuver, find another angle. So I sat in that motel room, humiliation still raw, and I began to plan. Cade had the spotlight, the networks, my father's influence, and the support of a system designed to protect men like him. But what they did not realize was that every broadcast, every article, every lie only deepened the cracks in their fortress. People who pay attention to detail would notice the inconsistencies, the overacting, the gaps. My job was to survive long enough to show them. Still, the days that followed were brutal. Strangers recognized me on the street and crossed to the other side. A neighbor who once waved now pulled her children closer when I walked past. The isolation became physical, a wall pressing in tighter every day. And yet inside that suffocating wall, something hardened. They had painted me as unstable, dangerous, broken, but the truth was that I had never been more focused. Their smear campaign did not destroy me, it clarified the battlefield. They thought they could strip me of credibility before I opened my mouth, but I still had my affidavit, my video, my dossier of women whose stories mirrored mine. Their media blitz was powerful, but it also revealed their fear. Only the guilty work that hard to discredit the truth before it can be spoken. The media war forced me to confront the depth of their power, but it also showed me that my fight was not just personal. It was systemic. Cade was a symptom my father was an enabler, but the disease was a culture that rewarded silence and punished dissent. Understanding that gave me new strength. I would not just clear my name, I would tear open the rot beneath their medals. But in those nights alone, when the glow of the television replayed Cade's smug face and my father's approving hand on his shoulder, the pain cut deep. Emotional undulation carried me from humiliation to determination, from despair to defiance and back again. Sometimes I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of the motel, hearing again the words, unstable and dangerous words. Cade had spoken on national television, words that strangers now repeated like gospel. I would close my eyes and picture the moment he pressed the shard of glass against my cheek and my father's cold voice saying, "You disappointed me." Those memories twisted with the public lies until it felt like the whole world was conspiring to silence me. But then I would reach into my pocket, feel the charred edges of my mother's note card, and the words written in her hand would steady me. Vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage. And with that reminder, I understood the truth about this media war. They had the microphones, but I had the voice. They could smear me, erase me, exile me, but as long as I refused to stay silent, they had not won. This was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of their unraveling. The night after Cade's television performance, I sat alone in my motel room, staring at the silent phone on the table, wondering how much longer I could fight this battle with only scraps of evidence and a fractured body when a new email notification appeared on my encrypted account. The sender's name made my breath catch. Anya Sharma, the investigative journalist whose exposés on military corruption had toppled generals and shaken entire commands, had written to me. Her message was short, direct, almost clinical. Lieutenant Cohen, I do not buy their version. If you have proof, I am prepared to listen. The truth deserves to be heard. For a moment, I simply stared at the words, my pulse racing hope and fear colliding inside me. If I revealed everything too soon, Cade and my father would brand me as unstable, even louder. But if I kept silent, their narrative would harden into fact. I closed my eyes and remembered my mother's handwriting on the scorched card, "Courage, not weakness," and I typed back a reply. My story is only one of many. Start here. I attached the anonymized dossier from the Sisterhood of the Scars and hit send. That night I realized I was no longer a solitary target. I was part of something larger, a hidden battalion of women whose voices had been buried but not extinguished. By morning, Anya had replied with 4 words. I am pursuing this. Those words were the first reinforcement I had felt in months. Still, even as hope flickered, the shadows grew darker. Later that same day, my burner phone buzzed again with a blocked number. I answered cautiously, and the strained voice of Dorian Lex filled my ear. "Rachel, you need to be careful," he whispered. "They are watching you. Your father is pulling every string, every call, every move." My stomach clenched, the motel walls seeming to close in around me. Dorian had always been steady, a man who measured words, and the fear in his voice chilled me. The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me in silence broken only by the thudding of my heart. For a long moment, despair threatened to drown me. If my father had the system, the influence, and now surveillance on his side, what chance did I have? But then another thought came sharper, clearer. If they were watching me, it meant they feared me. You do not waste resources tracking a ghost. You only track someone who has power. That realization steadied me. They could brand me unstable, erase me from family photos, burn my mother's memory to ash, but if my voice had no weight, they would not be scrambling so hard to silence it. Emotional undulation surged again. Fear clawed at me, yet defiance rose to meet it. I refused to surrender. My allies were few, but they were real. Carla's affidavit, the sisterhood's stories, Anya's commitment, Dorian's warning, even his fear. It all proved the truth was out there waiting to be revealed. That night, I logged into the encrypted forum again, my screen glowing in the dark room, and posted a message to the women who had already shared their scars. I told them I had proof video sworn statements and that if any of them had records, photos, emails, anything they had hidden for fear of retaliation, now was the time to gather it. Responses flooded in. Some were cautious, some were angry, but many were brave. Women sent me redacted copies of altered evaluations, screenshots of threatening messages, and notes from supervisors that made my skin crawl with their cruelty. I compiled everything into a second dossier, larger, heavier, undeniable. Every file was a reminder that I was not isolated, that this was not only my fight. The loneliness that had nearly broken me shifted into a grim camaraderie. I was part of the Sisterhood of the Scars, and together we were turning pain into ammunition. Days later, another ally stepped forward in the most unexpected way. I had gone to the public library again to check my encrypted messages when I felt a presence at my side. A man in civilian clothes hair, cropped military short, stood holding a book of military history. "Rachel," he said quietly, his voice tight. I froze until he added, "It's Dorian." He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes, but determination burned in his face. He told me he could not testify openly that my father's reach would destroy his career, but he pressed a small USB drive into my palm. "This is from the unofficial command meeting the day after the attack," he said. "I was on duty logging the minutes. My recorder was running. Do not tell them where you got it. Just make it count." Then he walked away, disappearing into the stacks. Back in my motel room, I plugged the drive into my laptop and listened with headphones. My father's voice filled my ears, cold, commanding, indisputable. "Get rid of her after action report. Bury it. The reputation of the Cohen family is more important than the feelings of one emotional girl." I froze, tears stinging my eyes because it was the smoking gun. Not just Cade's brutality, but my father's conspiracy caught in his own words. For a long moment, I sat in silence, my heart pounding, the weight of betrayal heavier than ever, yet transformed into power. The allies were no longer just sympathetic faces. They were weapons, each giving me a piece of truth sharper than any blade. Carla's affidavit, Anya's platform, the sisterhood's testimonies, Dorian's recording all converged into an arsenal. And with each new ally, my resolve grew stronger. Cade and my father had the system, but I had something they could never forge, a coalition built on truth. Emotional undulation surged again, despair into hope, isolation into unity, fear into strength. They thought they had exiled me, but every time they tried to bury me, another hand reached from the shadows to pull me up. Allies had appeared, and with them came the promise that the war of lies was nearing its breaking point. The Memorial Day sun hung heavy over Washington, D.C., the air thick with the kind of humid weight that pressed against the skin and made every breath feel slower, heavier, as if the city itself knew the importance of what was about to unfold. Crowds gathered along the National Mall, children waving small flags, veterans in faded caps standing silently before the black granite wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, tourists snapping photos of a place that carried too much grief to ever truly be captured by a lens. I stood among them in plain clothes, a simple gray jacket, hair pulled back, blending into the sea of strangers, my fractured arm long healed, but the scars beneath still fresh. From where I stood, I could see Cade arrive in immaculate dress blues, every metal polished until it gleamed under the sun, his smile wide, his stride, confident, surrounded by handlers and organizers who ushered him toward the podium. The sight made bile rise in my throat. He looked like the perfect soldier, the perfect heir to the Cohen name, and the crowd responded to that image with polite applause. My father was there too, standing just behind the front rows, his posture ramrod-straight eyes gleaming with pride, as though Cade had truly earned the honor of being the keynote speaker. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears as Cade took the stage, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. His voice carried across the lawn practiced smooth, rapping lies in the language of sacrifice and brotherhood. He spoke of courage, of honor, of the unbreakable bonds of Marines in combat, painting himself as the calm leader who had carried others through chaos. I closed my eyes and could still see the helmet cam footage of him frozen with terror, rifle shaking in his hands while I dragged wounded men to safety. Hearing him twist that memory into a story of his own heroism was like being struck all over again. But I forced myself to stand still, breathing through the fury that coiled inside me. Emotional undulations surged, rage burned, grief stabbed, but beneath it all, clarity hardened. This was the moment I had been preparing for. Cade finished his speech to polite applause, stepped down from the podium, and began shaking hands, posing for photographs, basking in the admiration that was not his to claim. That was when I moved, not with a rush or a shout, but with the steady, deliberate pace of a soldier on a mission. The crowd parted unconsciously, sensing the shift in energy, the calm before a storm. Cade's smile faltered as his eyes found mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of panic break through his polished mask. I stopped directly in front of him, close enough that every bystander could hear, close enough that he could not pretend not to see me. My voice was clear, level, and cold. "The medals on your chest," I said, "belong to men and women who earned them with blood and sacrifice. You stole them. You stole my story." The air seemed to tighten, silence rippling outward through the crowd as people turned toward us. I lifted my chin toward the black granite wall behind him, its surface reflecting his face warped and twisted. "Do you feel ashamed standing in front of the names on this wall? Do you feel worthy of them?" The color drained from his cheeks, his mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but only stammered syllables came out. What are you talking about?" He tried, his voice cracking, but the mask had already slipped. The crowd began to murmur, confusion and suspicion spreading as they looked from him to me. I stepped closer, the final blow in my words sharp and precise. "You can steal medals, you can steal stories, but you can never steal honor because you never had it to begin with." For a heartbeat, the world held still. Cade's mouth hung open, his polished image shattered under the weight of the truth spoken plainly. My father stood frozen, fury in his eyes, but he could not move, not here, not with all those witnesses. Then the whispers grew louder, people pulling out phones, recording, capturing the confrontation. Cade tried to regain composure, forcing a smile, but it looked grotesque, and he turned away quickly, leaving me standing in the open. I did not chase him. I turned my back and walked calmly into the crowd, disappearing among strangers, but I knew the moment had landed. It was the first public fracture in the facade they had built. Emotional undulations surged through me again, fear of what retaliation would follow, triumph at having pierced the image, and a strange serenity that came from knowing I had spoken truth aloud where all could hear. The Memorial Day event ended with the usual ceremony, but its memory would be defined not by Cade's speech, but by the confrontation that followed, whispered about in every corner, shared on every phone that recorded it. For the first time, the story was not only theirs, it was mine too, and it was out in the world. And as I walked away from the memorial, the words of my mother's note card echoed in my mind. Vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage. I had shown them my voice, and no matter what came next, they could not erase it. The courthouse in Cumberland County loomed like an old fortress, its red brick and white columns casting long shadows across the steps where reporters and bystanders clustered with cameras and notepads eager for spectacle. I walked through those doors not in uniform, but in a dark gray suit. My only adornment, the small pendant forged from the melted remains of my medals hanging against my collarbone like a scar made visible. Inside, the air was thick with tension, every cough, every shuffle echoing too loudly, the weight of expectation pressing on everyone present. My father sat in the front row behind Cade's legal team, his back perfectly straight, his eyes fixed on me with a look that was both contempt and warning, as though daring me to continue. Cade himself sat at the defendant's table, jaw tight, but eyes rehearsed with the same practiced sorrow he had shown on television. When the proceedings began, his lawyer painted a portrait of him as a decorated war hero, a devoted family man maligned by a jealous, unstable cousin who could not handle his success. The words were smooth, carefully chosen, designed to erode my credibility before I even spoke. Then Cade took the stand, and his performance was masterful. He spoke in a soft, almost trembling voice about how he had always tried to protect me, how I had grown erratic after deployment, how he feared for me but never stopped caring. He told the jury that I had been drinking the night of the attack, that I had lunged at him in rage, that I must have broken my own arm when I fell. He described me as reckless, unstable, too competitive to accept that another Cohen had been recognized. Emotional undulation clawed at me as I listened, humiliation surging when the jurors leaned forward as if believing his lies rage-burning when he claimed to love me while tearing me apart with every sentence. His lawyer introduced the falsified medical record as Exhibit A, showing an X-ray dated months before the attack, claiming it proved my injury was old evidence of instability rather than assault. I could see doubt flicker across the faces of the jury, and for a moment fear gripped me that the system would once again bury me under the weight of men's lies. But then Evelyn Reed rose for cross-examination, calm and sharp as a blade. She walked slowly to the stand, her voice measured and polite as she praised Cade for such a compelling story. The jury relaxed, lulled by her tone until she turned to the judge and requested permission to present a short video from my helmet camera. Cade's lawyer leapt to his feet with objections, but the judge allowed it. The lights dimmed, a screen lowered, and the grainy footage began. Gunfire rattled through the courtroom speakers, chaos filled the screen, and there was Cade, cowering against a crumbling wall rifle, shaking in his hands, terror etched across his face. Then, the image shifted to me dragging two wounded Marines to safety, bandaging one under fire, and his voice audible, saying, "Thank you, Cohen, you saved my life." The silence in the courtroom was absolute, heavy, unbroken until the video ended and the lights returned. Every eye turned toward Cade, whose face had gone pale, his carefully constructed image disintegrating. Evelyn let the silence stretch until it was unbearable, then introduced the audio file from the command meeting Dorian's recording. My father's voice filled the room, cold and authoritative, saying, "Get rid of her after action report, bury it. The reputation of the Cohen family is more important than the feelings of one emotional girl." Gasps erupted from the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads in disbelief. My father's mask of composure cracked for the first time, his lips tightening, his eyes darting the image of a man exposed by his own words. When it was my turn to take the stand, I walked with steady steps, every eye following me, the pendant warm against my skin. I told my story not with theatrics, not with trembling, but with the calm steadiness of truth. I recounted the night Cade stormed into my quarters, the blows, the broken bones, the shard of glass pressed against my cheek, and then the moment my father entered and condemned me instead of saving me. My voice did not waver. When I finished, I unclasped the pendant and held it high for the jury to see. "They burned my uniforms, my medals, my history," I said, "but they could not burn my honor. They tried to erase me, but they only made me stronger." Then I turned my gaze directly at my father, locking eyes with him so the whole courtroom could see, and I said clearly, "That man is no longer my father." The words dropped into the silence like a gavel of their own final irrevocable. The verdict, when it came, felt like the slow exhale of a breath I had been holding for years. Cade Thorne was found guilty on all counts: assault, perjury, conduct unbecoming of an officer. He was sentenced to 15 years in military prison and dishonorably discharged, stripped of the uniform he had pretended to honor. He sat hollow, staring blankly, the smirk that had haunted me erased from his face forever. As for my father, legal maneuvering spared him a prison sentence, but he was forced into retirement. His career ended in disgrace. His reputation shattered his silence, now his only companion. The king had been dethroned not with bullets or fists, but with evidence, truth, and the voice he had tried to silence. Emotional undulation surged one last time inside that courtroom, despair, transforming into vindication, humiliation, into triumph, isolation, into the power of being heard. And as the judge's gavel cracked through the air, I knew the war of lies was over and I had won. When the trial ended and the gavel came down for the final time, I walked out of that courthouse into the bright Carolina sun with Evelyn at my side and a throng of reporters shouting questions, their microphones shoved forward like weapons, but I kept moving because I had no words left for them. I was exhausted to my bones, my spirit hollowed out, and yet beneath that exhaustion was something new, a quiet peace that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with survival. Justice had been delivered on paper. Cade sentenced to prison. My father forced into retirement, the family name they worshipped tarnished forever. But the truth was that victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like release. A few days later, I returned to the house that had once been my childhood home, now stripped bare and waiting to be sold. The walls were pale where pictures had once hung, the rooms hollow, filled only with echoes of a past I no longer wished to carry. I passed my father in the hallway for the last time, his shoulders slumped, his eyes empty of remorse or apology, and I gave him only a brief nod before walking away. That was the final severing of a tie that had bound me in pain for decades. I reported once more to my commanding officer, who offered me reinstatement medals, restored apologies issued, but I declined. I told him I no longer needed them because I already knew the truth, and the truth was enough. I left the Marine Corps not as a victim pushed out, but as a soldier who had completed her final mission. 6 months later, I used settlement money to buy a weathered cottage in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a small house with peeling paint, and a porch that looked out over the Atlantic. For the first time in my life, the only sounds I heard at night were the waves breaking against the shore and the wind moving through the dunes. Peace did not strike like lightning. It seeped into me slowly with every barefoot walk on the cool sand, every sunrise over the horizon, every breath of salt air that filled my lungs. I began planting sunflowers in the small patch of sandy soil beside my porch, their tall stalks bending toward the light, resilient against the wind, and they became my symbol of survival, of growth from ashes. One rainy afternoon, I unpacked the last box of my mother's books and discovered a false bottom I had never noticed before. Inside was a sealed envelope with her handwriting addressed to me. My hands shook as I opened it and read her words, her voice echoing across time. True honor lives in the truth, your truth, and it is the most powerful thing you will ever own. Use your voice. Be the fire I was never brave enough to become. Tears spilled down my face, not of grief, but of release, because in those words she gave me absolution. I finally stopped living for my father's definition of honor and began living for my own. I started volunteering at a local veterans outreach center, pouring coffee, listening, sitting in folding chairs under harsh fluorescent lights with women who carried their own scars. I told my story not with the clipped facts of the courtroom, but with the raw honesty of someone who had walked through betrayal and come out the other side. One young medic in her 20s whispered me too through her tears, and in that moment, the sisterhood of the scars lived again, not just online, but in flesh and blood, in a circle of women sharing the burden together. My legacy was not in medals or ranks. It was in creating a space where others could feel safe enough to speak, to say me too, to know they were not alone. The pendant I once wore into court now hangs on my porch, a scarred piece of metal catching the light each morning, scattering fractured rainbows across my doorstep like a reminder that broken things can still be beautiful. Sometimes, when the ocean breeze is just right, I stand there and whisper to the wind, I am using my voice. Mom, because justice was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. And to those who hear me now, to those who have ever been silenced, betrayed, or erased, I say this: your story does not have to end in ashes. It can begin with a whisper. It can grow into a voice, and it matters. If you are watching, if you have carried scars you were told to hide, let me know by writing 3 words in the comments. My voice matters because it does, because every story reclaimed is another crack in the walls built by silence. That is the consequence of what Cade and my father tried to do to me. They sought to bury me, but instead they planted me, and from the soil of betrayal I have grown into someone they can never erase. The battlefield is behind me, the ocean is my horizon. The sunflowers stretch taller every day, and I have chosen to live not as a soldier defined by someone else's code, but as a woman who defines honor by truth. This is not just my rebirth, it is my invitation. Speak, even if your voice shakes, because silence is the weapon they use, and voice is the fire that will burn their lies away. If you have followed me all the way through this journey, if you have walked with me from the barracks floor stained with my blood to the quiet porch where sunflowers turn their faces to the light, then you already know this story is not just about me. It is about every person who has ever been silenced by family, betrayed by those who should have protected them, erased by a system that values image over truth. My voice became my weapon and my truth became my shield, but I did not fight this war alone. I fought it with the echoes of my mother's words, with the steady hand of a nurse who chose courage over fear, with the testimonies of women who had been told to stay quiet, with the warnings of a friend who risked his safety to give me proof. Every piece of my resistance came from connection from someone else daring to say, "I believe you." And now I am asking you, wherever you are, whatever your story, to join me in that same act of courage. It begins with something small. It begins with choosing not to stay silent. It begins with 3 simple words: my voice matters. Maybe you are watching this on your phone late at night, sitting in your kitchen while the rest of the house sleeps. Maybe you are watching from a hospital bed or from the front seat of your car in a parking lot, because that is the only place you can breathe without someone hovering over you. Maybe you are older, carrying decades of scars no one else ever saw. Maybe you are young and just beginning to realize how heavy betrayal can feel when it comes from the people you love most. Wherever you are, I want you to know that your story, your pain, your resilience matters. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. For too long, I believed that silence was safety, that if I worked harder, obeyed more, achieved enough, I could win love or approval. But silence did not protect me. It protected them. And when I finally spoke, when I finally dared to lift my voice, the very walls built to contain me began to crack. That is why I am asking you not to let this be a story you watch and forget. Let it be a story that reminds you of your own strength. Let it be a story that stirs something inside you that cannot be pushed back into the dark. Write in the comments, "My voice matters." Not because it is a trend, not because it helps an algorithm, but because each time those words appear, they become another stone in a wall of truth too strong for lies to topple. Each time someone writes them, someone else who feels alone will see and know they are not. And if you have ever been the one who was dismissed, who was told you were unstable or unworthy, if you have ever been erased from the story of your own life, then you know how powerful it is to see even one person stand beside you and say, "You are not invisible." This channel is more than storytelling. It is a gathering place for voices that refuse to die in silence. It is a place where scars are not hidden, but honored, where betrayal does not have the final word, where healing is possible because we choose to speak. By commenting, by subscribing, by sharing, you are not just supporting me, you are building that place brick by brick. You are telling the world that family honor does not mean sacrificing daughters, that reputation does not outweigh truth, that no system, no matter how powerful, can survive when enough people stand and speak together. Maybe you think your story is too small, too ordinary, not worth telling. Let me tell you this: no voice is ordinary. Every truth spoken is a spark, and sparks gather into fire. I was nearly erased, nearly broken, but the spark of my mother's note card carried me through. Your spark can carry someone else. Do not underestimate that power. If you are part of the generation watching now, 50 or older, you already know how many voices in your lifetime were smothered. You have seen neighbors, coworkers, friends silenced for the sake of reputation. You have carried your own secrets because that was what was expected. But here, now you have the chance to show that silence is no longer acceptable, that your voice, your experience, your scars matter just as much as mine. Leave a comment. Share your place in this chorus. Say my voice matters and let those words be both shield and banner. I promise you I will read them. I will carry them. And together we will remind the world that honor is not found in medals or in ranks or in the applause of crowds. Honor is found in truth. and truth only lives when we speak it. Do not let my story be the only one that survives. Add yours. Whisper it if you must. Shout it if you can, but write it down, claim it, give it breath, because justice was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. And your story, your justice, your healing can begin right now with 3 words. My voice matters.